أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. My dear brothers and sisters, family that is watching, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We are here for our second session of our history nights. We had our first session last Wednesday, and this is going to be a recurring show that happens here on IlmFeed every Wednesday. And we're going to be joined by our esteemed guest, as you can see on the screen next to me, Brother Mustafa Briggs. Brother Mustafa, how are you doing? Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. Alhamdulillah.
Hope you're well, inshallah. I know you're joining us all the way from Cairo, but for those of you that couldn't make it last week, our beloved teacher today, Mustafa Briggs, actually graduated from the University of Westminster, specializing in Arabic literature, and he moved on to do an MA at SOAS in translation, again specializing in the Arabic language. And where he's joining from us at the moment, actually in Cairo. He then moved on to study Islamic studies and Arabic at the Al-Azhar Institute. And Brother Mustafa, actually, some of you may know from some of the previous series that he's done in the past, the Beyond Bilal lecture series, very, very famous. And I'd implore you, if you haven't already seen that, to tune into that, inshallah. But for those of you that are watching and maybe this is the first show that you're getting involved in, make sure you check out the IlmFeed YouTube page. You can catch up with last week's show. You can catch up with the history nights that we had during the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. And there's all sorts of podcasts on there from a number of amazing guests, inshallah. And as we like to do every single week, we're not very original here or innovative. But for those of you that are watching, we would love to see you in the comments section. We would love to see where you are from. So there's already a lot of comments that are coming on here. If you can post an emoji of your country, if you don't know the flag of your country, then shame. But if you're able to post the flag of your country and then write the name of the country you're from, we love seeing the Ummah unite here on the IlmFeed, and what better way than through emojis, inshallah. So do let us know what countries you're joining us from, and we'd love to get as many people as we can on here. So what is the topic of today? Today's topic, bi'idhnillah, is going to be on the West African Muslim empires. I know I'm very excited to hear today's lecture, today's talk, and I'm hoping that we learn something new about the West African Muslim empire. A lot of us have a bit of a history. Some of the empires of West Africa are quite well known, especially for those in Mali, etc. But maybe we'll hear something new. Maybe we'll hear something different, something which we don't always hear in the mainstream. I can see Sweden, Canada, France, Nigeria, Morocco, Mali, USA, Guinea, and Pakistan. Keep those cities coming at the end, inshallah. We'll make sure that we note them. If you hear something or learn something special, a gem from today's lecture, write it down, and we want you to post it. And at the end, we'll pick the best gems that we can. But that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to our teacher, Mustafa Briggs, and we're going to hear about West African Muslim empires. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه حق قدره ومقداره العظيم ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, it's a pleasure to join you again for the second week in a row discussing different topics to do with Black history and Islam. I'm honored for the invitation by IlmFeed in association with the charity that sponsored this, inshallah. May Islamic Relief, may Allah bless everyone that's involved in making this happen, inshallah, and all of our viewers at home. So as mentioned today, inshallah, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we're going to start by talking about the West African Muslim empires. And I feel like this topic is very important as West African Muslim empires played a large role in the spread of Islam across West Africa and across sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at statistics, we see that Africa is the continent with the highest percentage of Muslims. So it's the largest Muslim majority continent. There are more Muslims percentage-wise in Africa than anywhere else or any other continent. And if we look, 1/3 of the world's Muslims live in Africa, with 1/6 of the world's Muslims living in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa being nations such as Nigeria, such as Ghana, such as Senegal, such as Sierra Leone, such as the Gambia, where I am from, such as Chad, Niger, etc., all the way into, East Africa, and all of these places. And so when we look at the Muslim empires of West Africa and the story of how Islam entered there, it gives us a better understanding as to the spread of Islam in those regions. So what is interesting is that for many people, they often assume that when they see black people or when they see West Africans in Islam, that Islam is not native to those areas or Islam has recently arrived in those areas. This is something that I've personally experienced. You know, taxi drivers, you get into an Uber, especially here in Cairo. Where are you from? I'm from Gambia, or I'm from Senegal, or I'm from Nigeria. Oh, okay. Fi Muslimi? There are Muslims there? Of course, there are Muslims there. And just to look back at when does Islam enter this region, we have to look back all the way to the time of the Sahaba of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Immediately after the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam passed away, we know that the Khilafah passed on to Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and then Sayyidina Umar, and then Sayyidina Uthman, and then Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib. And then after the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the Umayyad Khilafah begins with Muawiyah the first, and then his son Yazid. So during the time of Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, we see that he dispatched some generals into Africa in order for them to spread Islam in Africa. And this section of history is what they call the Futuhat, the openings. One of the generals that he dispatched was a Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ by the name of Uqba bin Nafi. And he traveled with his uncle Amr bin As. They opened Egypt to Islam, and after Egypt, they continued to conquer North Africa. And Uqba bin Nafi managed to settle in Tunisia, and he established a city there called Karawan. And Karawan became very essential for the spread of Islam in Africa in general, as Karawan grew to become a center of learning. And many of the ulama and many of the scholarly families in North and West Africa claim their descent through Uqba bin Nafi, which is something that maybe we'll discuss later on in the lecture. Not only did we see the Sahaba and the generals of the Umayyads entering North Africa, but we also saw the family of the Prophet ﷺ moving into West Africa. So into North Africa, sorry. So we see, for example, in Egypt, we have Sayyidah Nafisa, who is one of the granddaughters of Imam Hassan. If we move further west into Morocco, we see that the first king of Morocco was Mawlai Idris al-Akbar, who was the son of Abdullah al-Kamil, and Abdullah al-Kamil was the grandson of Sayyidina Hussein on his father's side, and Sayyidina Hassan on his father's side, and Sayyidina Hussein on his mother's side. As Abdullah al-Kamil's father was Hassan al-Muthanna, the son of Hassan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his mother was Fatima bint al-Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. So he moved from, during the persecution of the family of the Prophet ﷺ by the Khilafahs in the Middle East at that time, his brother Muhammad Nafs Zakiya tried to revolt against the Khilafah and was defeated. And then he, Mawlai Idris, decided to move away from the Middle East and into West Africa. And he came across a tribe who had already converted to Islam. They were native Amazigh people. And the chief of that tribe, who was Muslim, gave his daughter Kinza to Mawlai Idris as a wife. And he settled down. He had a son, Idris al-Azhar, and Idris al-Azhar was the one who founded the imperial city of Fez. And this is all roughly 1,100 years ago. So where does West Africa come into play? So during that time, the main source of gold for North Africa and for the Middle East and for most of the world at that time was from West Africa. And there were mighty kingdoms that existed in West Africa before the establishment of Islam and before Islam was being brought there. And these kingdoms had already established trade relations with the North. And so Islam started to enter into West Africa through the influence of these traders and these trading relations. If we look, the most powerful empire in West Africa at that time was an empire called the Ghana Empire, not to be confused with modern day Ghana as we know it today, which was named after the original Ghana Empire by Kwame Nkrumah, as he wanted to relive the legacy of this great West African empire in the establishment of his new nation, which was formerly known as the Gold Coast. So when the Gold Coast received independence from the British in 1960, I believe, if I'm wrong, please correct me, he decided to rename the Gold Coast Ghana after this ancient empire that I'm about to talk about. So the Ghana Empire, and we know a lot of what we know about the history of West African Muslim empires through two main books, Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fattash. which were books that were written by West African scholars in the scholarly center of Timbuktu. If you don't know about Timbuktu or the Sankore Masjid, I will speak about it briefly tonight, but I would refer you to my previous video that I had completed for IlmFeed, where I spoke about the Sankore University. So with this Ghana Empire, in the book Tariq al-Sudan, we see that they say that the Ghana Empire had 20 kings before the time of the Prophet ﷺ and 20 kings after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning that it was a very ancient empire that was firmly established in the region before the coming of Islam. So roughly 1,000 years ago, we start to see the influence of traders coming in from the north in the areas that the Sahaba and the family of the Prophet ﷺ had opened. And they start to settle in the Ghana Empire and trade. And so we see that in the year 10, in the early 1000s, we have an account of a scholar from Andalus, from Spain, called Al-Umari, who narrates that, called Al-Bakri, sorry, and he narrates that the king of the Ghana Empire at that time, who was not Muslim, lived a great and honorable life due to his friendship of the Muslims. And he states that the Bakri, this states that the capital city of this king was divided into two towns, and one town was for the Muslims and one town was for the non-Muslims. So all the way 1,000 years ago, in the middle of West Africa, the most powerful empire in West Africa, ancient Ghana, which is in modern-day Mali and Mauritania. The capital is in between Mali and Mauritania. The king of the Ghana Empire, who was called Bassi at that time, had a town within the capital city specifically for the Muslims, because there were so many Muslim traders who were coming in, and also natives who had converted to the religion of Islam. And within this town, they had 12 masjids, one of which was the Friday Mosque. And in the king's own town, which was the non-Muslim town, the king had built a masjid in his own palace where visiting traders or visiting delegations from Muslim areas could come to pray. So Ghana was a magnet for Muslim traders because of the abundance of gold in the region. And gold was the standard currency there. And this king was so wealthy that he could afford to raise a large army of 200,000 troops and 40,000 archers and a large cavalry. And so we can see then the power and the influence that this empire had. And this king, the minister of finances in his kingdom, most of his interpreters and most of the ministers in his government were all Muslims. So we see this case of Muslims and non-Muslims living together. And even within his town, he had a tribe called the Hunahiyin, who were descendants of troops sent to Ghana by the Umayyad Khilafah during the first opening of Islam. So when I spoke about Muawiyah sending in Uqba bin Nafi, etc., the descendants of the soldiers who came from Arabia, who came from Quraysh, a lot of them had established their own community within the Ghana Empire. So we can see the relationship between the two. And what's very interesting about this as well is that we never hear of any Arab conquest of West Africa. So the Arabs didn't come in and force people to convert to Islam, but rather through trade and through intermarriage and through settling and through education, native Africans decide to convert to Islam due to their interaction with these people. But it's interesting to note that both traditional African religions and the peaceful practice of Islam accommodated each other. And this spirit of accommodation is something that still exists within West Africa today. So after the reign of Bassi, we see one of his successors called Warjabi. We see one of his successors called Kaya Magasise become one of the first people to convert to Islam. And this is estimated to be in the year 1037. So after Islam was already established in the kingdom, we see the first conversion of the rulers, turning these empires into Muslim states. And just next door in Takrur, the king Warjabi also converts to Islam. And Takrur was a Fulani empire. And these people were the earliest people to take Islam and make it the constitution of their kingdom. So we see Takrur, which is in northern Senegal, officially convert to Islam in the 1030s, the same time as the Ghana Empire, just next door in Mali, converts to Islam. And after that, we start to see the spread of Islam not just through traders now, but through clerical and scholarly families. And this is where the role of a certain tribe of people called the Jahankei comes in. This is something that I really feel is not spoken about a lot, but needs to be spoken about. So Islam coexisted with these traditional religions earlier, and then afterwards, as people started to convert to Islam, many tribes and families decided to dedicate themselves to scholarship. And when they dedicated themselves to scholarship, they formed scholarly families or scholarly tribes. So one of these is the Jahankei people, and their grand sheikh was a man called Al-Haji Salim Suware. And Al-Haji Salim Suware was somebody who influenced the spread of Islam throughout West Africa. The missionaries of Islam in West Africa were mostly clerics at this time and not traders. So initially the people that brought Islam were traders, and then they became clerics, they became scholars, they became ulama. And these ulama had knowledge not just of religious sciences, but of traditional medicine and of ruqya and of spiritual practices as well. So wherever they went, their goal was to establish a self-subsistent community focused on three main activities: teaching, farming, and prayer in the masjid. So wherever they went, they would build a masjid for prayers and for education. They would build a school, a madrasa, in order to teach people how to read and write. And they would build a farm in order for them to be self-subsistent, so that no matter what the political current was at the time, whoever was ruling the country, they didn't have to depend on government sponsorship. They didn't have to cater to the whims of kings and rulers, but rather they could be self-sufficient and independent and be able to give their dawah. And their call was to also bring benefit to any community that they entered. So they would enter non-Muslim communities and establish a madrasa. People will send their children to the madrasa because Islam was seen as the key to the wider world. If people went to study Arabic in a madrasa, they would be able to learn a language that would allow them access to traders in the north, that would allow them access to literacy, which was very rare at the time, and allow them access to a globalized community. And so many children were raised as Muslims just from going to these madrasas that were set up by the Jahankei people. Not only that, but the sheikhs of the Jahankei would heal people from their illnesses. They would pray for people. They would provide spiritual services. They would provide advice. And so we start to see them spreading across West Africa. And the teaching of Al-Haji Salim Suware was that jihad, in order to convert people to Islam, is not a valid practice in that time and space, but rather jihad through teaching, jihad through service, jihad through being a benefit to your community is what will open the doors for people to come to Islam. And their main focus was memorization of the Quran, study of the Arabic language, and study of the hadith and study of the traditional sciences. So we see that these people, these scholars, after the traders, were the ones that spread Islam across West Africa. And we hardly ever hear about anything to do with war or fighting or people imposing Islam on others, but rather it was hundreds of years of people having interaction with Muslims and converting to Islam of their own free will. So after Takur and Ghana, we see another empire emerge, which became the most powerful empire we can say in the history of West Africa, which was the Mali Empire. And the Mali Empire was united by a man called Sunjata Keita. And Sunjata Keita, many people debate as to whether he was Muslim or not. But one thing for sure was that his successor, who was known as Manding Bori Keita, who was his brother, was Muslim. And he had a son as well. And the son was one of the famous people whose account of conversion to Islam was well known and well recorded in the books at that time. So Sunjata Keita's son, and this is a very interesting story. So some people say this is Sunjata Keita's son, some people say it's his relative, but it was one of the rulers of the Mali Empire. And he was having a problem in his empire at the time as there was a drought. And this story serves to focus as this story serves as an example of how kings and nations were converting to Islam at that time. We see this king of Mali having a problem with drought in his kingdom. And as this problem starts to spread, they start to do sacrifices to their traditional gods and their traditional deities that they used to worship. And none of the sacrifices seemed to be working. But he had a Muslim guest at that time who he asked for advice. As he saw him praying 5 times a day, he saw him having communication with some kind of unseen God, and he was very dedicated in his worship. So he said, this man is a man that has powers, he has connection to the unseen. So I'm going to ask him if he has any advice or how I can be helped in my situation. And so he approached him, and the man said to him, if you want me to help you, I have one condition. You should bear witness that there is only one God and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger, meaning you should become Muslim. And if you bear witness to this, I'll teach you a prayer that will save your kingdom, and you'll see the blessings of Allah in your kingdom. And so the king decided to convert to Islam and give it a go. And the man taught him Islam, taught him how to practice his 5 pillars, taught him basic fiqh, basic Quran, etc. And then they performed a sunnah prayer called Salatul Istisqa together. And this account is written in the history books, in the books of Tariq al-Fatah and Tariq al-Sudan. After this prayer was made, rain started to come and the drought ended. And as the drought ended, the king decided to abolish the traditional religion and practice Islam and make Islam the state religion. And that's how Islam started to spread. And amongst that king's family emerged another famous king who we'll talk about briefly, Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa was the descendant of this original Sunjata Keita. Sunjata Keita only had one biological son whose name was Mansa Uli. And then his brother, Mansa Bori, took over after Sunjata passed away because Mansa Uli was too young. And Manding Bori Keita was the grandfather of Sunjata Keita. So Manding Bori Keita, was the grandfather of Mansa Musa Keita. So Mansa Musa was the grandson of the brother of Sunjata, who was the one that united this empire together. So as the presenter mentioned earlier, Mansa Musa is somebody who we've all heard about. We've heard about his miraculous Hajj, and we've heard about his wealth. We've heard about, and if you haven't heard about the universities and the institutes of higher learning that he built after he came back from Hajj, I will refer you again to the former IlmFeed video that I did called the Sankora University. If you type that in on YouTube, you'll be able to find it. But I just want to give you an example of how wealthy Mansa Musa is. So Mansa Musa, for example, when he went on his Hajj, he gave 200 mithqals of gold to the person who was the guide that took him to Hajj, and he gave 5,000 mithqals of gold to the Emir of Cairo who hosted him in Egypt, where I currently am today. So if we look at a mithqal is equal to 4.2 grams, and 4.2 grams of gold, 4.25 grams of gold is worth $243 or 200 pounds. So 200 mithqals of gold was $48,000 in today's terms, nearly $49,000. And the 5,000 that he gave to the Emir of Cairo was $1.2 million in today's terms. So upon his return, he continued to patronize the arts. He built masjids. Every Friday he used to build a new masjid. And one of the masjids, as I mentioned earlier, became a center of learning, the Sankore Institute. And after his reign and after the fall of the Mali Empire, we see another empire rise that we don't hear too much about, but I want to talk about here, which was the Songhai Empire of the Soninke people. The Songhai Empire rose after the fall of the Mali Empire, and it took over all of its previous territories. And what's interesting about the Songhai Empire is that they have a famous king called Sunni Ali Ber and another king called Askia Muhammad. And Askia Muhammad, similar to Mansa Musa, also went on Hajj. And when he went on Hajj, similar to Mansa Musa again, he took an overwhelming amount of gold and he donated loads of gold in charity. But he did something very impressive that served as a testament to the influence and power of West African Muslim empires at that time. When he arrived in Mecca, at that time Mecca was under the authority of the Uthmani, the Ottoman Khilafah, and they had established a family of descendants of the Prophet ﷺ called the Sharifs of Mecca, and they were the ones who ruled over Mecca at that time. And when Askia Muhammad arrived in Mecca, he worked with the Sharif of Mecca to establish a hostel for African pilgrims who wanted to make Hajj or Umrah. And so, with all the wealth that he had, he built in Mecca a large building. Today, we could call it a hotel or a hostel, which was a waqf, meaning it was a grant that he had given to the Muslim community. And he recruited people to look after them, and he paid a salary to them. And so any West Africans who traveled to Mecca on Hajj or Medina on Hajj, they were able to stay in these hostels that were established by Askia Muhammad with the Sharif of Mecca. Not only that, but he recruited scholars from Egypt and Morocco to come back with him to West Africa and teach in the Sankore Masjid in Timbuktu. And he was the one that commissioned the books Tarikh al-Sudan and Tarikh al-Fatash, one of which was written by his nephew, who was also a scholar, just to show you that the royal families were not just families of nobility and royalty, but they were families of scholarship. And so, on his way back to West Africa, he even was said to have sat in the classes of Jalaluddin Suyuti, the famous Egyptian scholar, and he brought back a lot of Jalaluddin Suyuti's books. And Jalaluddin Suyuti makes mention of having a relationship, being a pen pal with one of these West African kings, just to show you that West Africa was very much on the map in the Muslim world at that time. So Askia Muhammad encouraged learning, he encouraged literacy, and he ensured that the universities produced some of the most distinguished scholars in the world. One of whom, as I mentioned earlier, was his nephew, Mahmoud Kati. So Mahmoud Kati was the one who published Tarikh al-Fatash, and another scholar by the name of Abdul Rahman al-Sa'adi published Tarikh al-Sudan. And these are the two books which are indispensable to present-day scholars in reconstructing African history in the Middle Ages. And not just to focus on the furthermost point of West Africa, but in the last 5 or 6 minutes that we have, we can see that these Malians and these scholars from Mali traveled across the world, and across the world and across West Africa. One of the places that they traveled to, these Jahankei traders, which was a famous center of scholarship at the time, was Kano in northern Nigeria. And this brings the focus to the largest African country with the largest population of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, as Nigeria has over 100,000 Muslims. Islam starts to enter northern Nigeria through trade routes again with North Africa, but also with West Africa. And many people downplay the role that the Mali Empire had in the spread of Islam in Nigeria. But we see, for example, a scholar from Mali called Abdurrahman Jahankei, who left Mali in the year 1431 and said that he was going on pilgrimage. And he left with an entourage of 3,636 scholars that had mastered all of the Islamic sciences, just to show you the power and the strength of Islamic scholarship at that time. He left due to political instability in the Mali Empire at that time, and his excuse was that he was going on Hajj, but really he wanted to make hijrah, he wanted to migrate. And so, as he left with 3,636 scholars, he reached a river and he crossed this river and continued to travel until he reached Kano in northern Nigeria. And in Kano, he settled down and he became one of the most famous scholars of Maliki fiqh and one of the most famous Islamic scholars in that time. And this route was a route that had been taken by many, many people. And just after him, Abdurrahman, for example, he was a teacher to the Sultan of Kano at that time, the Emir of Kano, called Muhammad Rumfa. And Muhammad Rumfa was one of the most famous emirs of Kano in history, as he was the one that built the palace, which is still standing today, roughly 600 years ago, 700 years ago. And he was one of the most famous kings in the history of northern Nigeria. And this legacy of scholarship and interaction with North Africa and with West Africa had a very large impact on Nigeria. And we see, for example, many people from the Fulani tribe, and the Fulanis, as we know, were in Senegal, in Guinea, and in Mali, traveling to Nigeria and settling there. And their descendants later became the rulers of the northern Nigerian states. And if we look at the story of Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio, who I'm going to mention as the last person here, Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio was a Fulani whose ancestor Musa Jokoli migrated from Fouta in Senegal or Guinea, depending on which Fouta it is, Fouta Jalon or Fouta Toro, and he migrated into northern Nigeria. So we can see this trend, we can see this pattern of migration. And Musa Jokoli's descendant, Osman Danfodio, became a well-renowned scholar in his age. And towards the 1800s, the early 1800s, he decided to establish a kingdom. And this was because his students and his scholarly community that he had built were being threatened by a local king who did not like the spread of Islam in his kingdom. And so Usman Danfodio gave him an ultimatum: either you allow us to practice our religion in peace, or we will wage war and take over the kingdom so we can practice our religion in peace. And the king refused, and so he defeated the king and continued to spread his khilafah across northern Nigeria until it had reached even modern-day Niger and Chad. And they established what we now know as the Sokoto Khilafah. So I would encourage everyone to do research and understand the Sokoto Khilafah. And what's interesting is that framework established by Usman Danfodio in the Sokoto Khilafah still exists today in northern Nigeria. So if we look at northern Nigeria, I think 13 or 14 of the northern states ruled by Sharia law. And not only that, but the traditional emirs, who are the descendants of the generals of Usman Danfodio that he put in charge of each of the kingdoms that he took over, still rule and have political influence and cultural influence in northern Nigeria today. And they work alongside the federal government in administrating the laws of the country. So we can see that Islam is something that has had a long history and a long legacy in West Africa. We don't have time to talk about a 1,000-year legacy in a half-an-hour lecture as much as I had hoped, but please stay tuned and keep up with our social media on the IlmFeed profile and on my personal profile, as this is something that I dedicate a lot of time to teaching and explaining. And inshallah, I'll be able to see you all next week, where we talk about a very, very interesting subject, a subject that not many people talk about, but I feel is very, very interesting to talk about in this Black History Month, and that is Nana Asma'u and the female scholars of West Africa. So I'm going to continue this topic. I mentioned Usman Danfodio this week, and next week I'm going to talk about his daughter Asma and the particular aspect very interesting and very essential to the spread of Islam in West Africa. So we'll talk about Asma, the other female scholar that came after her in Senegal, in Mali, and in many different places, and how female scholarship and female empowerment was essential in the Islamic region. I hope to see you all next week, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakallah khair, Brother Mustafa. I know that the connection over there in Cairo sometimes goes up, sometimes goes down, but we had a lot of people that were tuned in and watching and listening to this amazing session. Again, for those of you that are tuning in from wherever you are around the world, if you have any gems that you took from this, something that you haven't heard before, please do comment it in the comment box. That's whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Facebook. We can actually see the comments here that come through. Once again, Mustafa is going to be joining us next week. So remember, this is part of a weekly series that we have of history nights here on IlmFeed. If you want to find out how you can find out more, just subscribe to the IlmFeed channel. It's easy. If you're on Facebook, like the page. Or you can do both if you want to be really smart about it, inshallah. And we want to make sure that we get as many of you on next week, because next week it's going to be on Nana Asma and the female scholars of West Africa. And so we heard a lot today about some of the well-known scholars like Mansa Musa, and we also heard about some scholars that we might not be aware of. But for next week, we're going to be looking at the female scholars of West Africa and focusing particularly on Nana Asma as well. Mustafa, you always get a chance to plug the next week, but can you give us in like 30 seconds, why should we be interested in the female scholars of West Africa? What is it that you're going to share that perhaps we don't know yet?
Well, I feel that female scholarship within the Muslim Ummah is something that we don't usually talk about. And African scholarship is something that we don't talk about in general anyway. So female West African scholars, I feel, is something that not a lot of people know about, but everyone should know about, as they serve not just as an inspiration to us, but as a blueprint of how we as Muslims should empower the women in our communities into leadership roles, not just in studying religious knowledge, but in giving them authority and power to have influence on all aspects of society, as these female scholars in West Africa did. Because not only were they scholars, they were political leaders, they were leaders who revolutionized their societies and where they lived, and led to a trend that helped preserve Islam and preserve humanity in that region. And so I feel like that's something interesting that everyone should take a lesson from, inshallah. And I'll be happy to share with you next week.
Hopefully you've sold a few of our viewers, and that's going to be next Wednesday, 7 p.m. here on the IlmFeed YouTube or Facebook channel, depends on what platform you prefer, inshallah. And we do want you to get involved. We've got a lot of comments here. We don't want people to feel that we're ignoring them. I'm just going to pick on one more comment because we're running out of time. The comment here is from, well, it's OS75. It's Mustafa, could you recommend some books? So maybe on the topic that you spoke about today, any particular book that you could recommend, or on any of the topics that we've spoken about or going to speak about in the next few weeks. Any books that we could recommend?
Yeah, so I do actually have a reading list that I have published on a website called Sacred Footsteps. And on that list, I've written a list of books, but I'll name a few of them here. I would say if you want to know about Nana Asma in particular, I would recommend a book called One Woman's Jihad by Beverly Blow Mack and Jean Boyd. And that talks about biography, it talks about her life, and it even gives translations of some of her books and poems. Also, there's another book called The African Caliphate by Ibrahim Suleiman, which talks about the works and teachings of Uthman Dan Fodio. The Walking Quran by Rudolf Ware, which talks about Islamic education and embodied knowledge in West African Islam. Beyond Timbuktu by Professor Usman Khan, and that's an intellectual history of Muslim West Africa. Another book, amazing book that I bought on my recent trip to Harvard University last year, called African Dominion from Michael Gomez, which is a new telling of empire in early and medieval West Africa, and that deals with a lot of themes specifically about the Muslim West African empires. There's another book called The Greater Jihad, Fighting the Greater Jihad, which speaks about a particular sheikh called Sheikh Ahmed Bamba in Senegal. And there's another book called Living Knowledge in West African Islam by Zachary Wright, which talks about the community of Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, also in Senegal. There's a book called Trans-Saharan Book Trade. And this book, The Trans-Saharan Book Trade, is a collection of different books and essays which talk about the intellectual history in West Africa. And last book that I'm going to recommend is Beyond Jihad, The Pacifist Tradition in West African Islam by Lamin Saneh, Laminsaneh.
And we can find it on which website was that, Mustafa?
You can find all of these, my book list is on Sacred Footsteps. So if you go on sacredfootsteps.com and then look for Mustafa Briggs, then you'll see the articles that I've written there, and this is one of them. And all of these books can be purchased online on Amazon, or you can download the PDFs if you know where to get them.
Fantastic. We've actually had 2 or 3 people ask about books. So hopefully, for those of you that commented, we do read your comments, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube. We've had so many people say that Quraisha, excellent discussion from South Africa. We had someone here from Senegal. We had someone from India. We had, who was it, Muhammad Ismail from India. And so for all of you that are watching, make sure you join next week. It's on Nana Islam and the female scholars of West Africa. This has been Atiq here on IlmFeed as part of History Nights with our guest, of course, Ustad Mustafa Briggs. And we'll see you next Wednesday, 7 p.m. Put it in your diary, remind your friends and remind your networks, and invite people that might know about this and have an interest in it, or those that don't, because maybe they'll have an interest in it afterwards. Jazakumullah khair for myself. Assalamu alaikum for myself and Brother Mustafa as well. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.